Man, I am just tanking today. Oof. I'm going to leave these in the video that stays on Discord just to show that I've got some bloopers because sometimes my mouth doesn't work. Let's try this again. Take 4. The game session is going well, and you are coming to a very salient point. You are concerned with how the players will respond to it, and you haven't even thought about what kind of possible skills they could use to overcome it. Hey, I'm Jonathan Albin, Nikos RPG, and we are going to be talking today about, in particular, sensory deprivation. That sounds kind of like a dark subject, and I think, at least in case of the optical loss, it sort of is. Before we get started, make sure you subscribe. That's all I'm concerned with right now. Let's get our subscriptions up, guys. We are on our way, and I want to get to the production of the Kickstarter. We're getting closer and closer in terms of our final edits are through on a couple more projects, so we'll be putting up the pre-release versions of those in the next few months. So watch for that as well. Alrighty, so we're going to go through the senses in order of basically priority, starting with the least necessary-ish sense, and then working up to the ones that are absolutely essential. But first of all, we're going to talk about the olfactory sense. Most of us don't even think about that when playing a role-play game, although in some conversational flavor text, so to speak, we'll mention something about the aroma of a place. If we're looking to make a place particularly ghoulish, we'll talk about the charnel smells and things like that. But generally speaking, there's not a lot of direct awareness of the other senses than visual and audio. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as well, because when we talk about the olfactory sense, it also is a protection mechanism. And even when it isn't actually able to determine what a threat is, quite often our sense of smell will provide us with some kind of alertness to there being a problem with the way a situation is playing out. So, for example, we're always familiar with the big offenders, so to speak. We're aware of what skunk-like smell is, and we have monsters that are built specifically to take advantage of that. But what about simple things like a meal being overcooked? That should, in many cases, you should be able to smell the beginnings of fire. You can pick up aromas of a lot of different things. So consider especially when you're talking about a scene that's a little bit more mundane in its nature, why not consider adding some sensory input from this sense? It's underplayed, so anytime you draw attention to it, you're going to be getting the player's attention right away. So it's kind of hard to underplay something that you don't focus on anyway. So this is really more of a wake-up call to utilizing the olfactory sense from time to time so that it can be a more useful trigger when it needs to be. Okay, here's one that gets completely overlooked. Most people don't focus much attention to gustatory sense, the idea of what something tastes like. And in this case, we're talking about sensory deprivation. And you generally, when you lose the sense of taste, it's usually associated with the sense of smell as well. So this one kind of is in a borderland. And obviously, since most of the adventuring time isn't actually consuming things, it's not necessarily useful. Although I have seen game masters use it when dealing with sumptuous feasts or food that's on the brink of spoiling. But consider at least the idea of removing players' ability to taste something in odd places. Like, for example, if you get a strong scent of eucalyptus or something along that lines that can actually block your ability to taste things or interfere with it. So consider perhaps some creatures around that actually can deprive you. Conversely, of course, you could also overplay it by having a monster that emits an aroma that like this savory smell of meat or whatever that makes your mouth actually water, so that the players will have triggers that are not generally a sense that they play off of. And the more you use sensory input, the more directly the players can interact with the world, because they're now not only just seeing it, but they're smelling it and tasting it and such like. And I know there should be some jokes come in, so yeah, please go ahead. I deserve it for that. But yes, I'm also saying that sometimes these sensory deprivations aren't necessarily in good taste. But I made the first one. All right, so feel free to plug more in at the time. But the idea of dealing with the sense of taste can also be an harbinger for the concept of perhaps something being poisoned or going bad, and by having them lose their sense of flavor. What's important to realize is that even when you aren't able to actually taste, you're actually getting the direct input of the byproducts of the process. So if you eat something that's spoiled, even if you didn't taste that it was spoiled, it will affect your digestive system, might make you queasy or nauseous or whatever. So just realize that having the inclusion of these byproduct sensory inputs, you're going to improve the realism of your game without having to spend a ton of time doing die rolling necessarily. Of course, it's important to be able to sense touch when you're actually touching something, in terms of its thermal condition. Maybe it's extremely hot, extremely cold. Perhaps it is rough. Perhaps it's actually very sharp. These are all things that your tactile senses give you, the ability of knowing what something feels like or how your body interacts with it when you are struck with it. In many cases, these kind of situations are overlooked again because we're so focused on, say, the numeric value of a person's hit point pool. We're not taking into account what the impact felt like. And by having some input on a constant basis, talking about the tactile response, letting them know that it's a particularly cold morning and that the wind chill has brought the temperature down to where it's, numbing to your fingertips. These are all things that can be played into in terms of their accuracy and ability to function. So if it's particularly cold and they've been warned that they have had a loss of the sense of touch, then perhaps they won't have a good enough grip on their weapon, or maybe it'll be difficult climbing. These kind of changes that appear because you're dealing with a sensory deprivation really kind of helps to add an intensity to the game that may not have been there otherwise. Many players want to constantly convert everything to a dice equivalency. So if you have a extremely cold condition, then your ability to hold on to your weapon is reduced, and thereby you get a modifier in case you're going to have the weapon knocked free. I'm not even talking about that. While that is a possibility, and especially if you are majorly impacted by the sense of touch yourself, then definitely play that up. But it's not necessarily even that. It's a matter of the ambiance of the scene. The nervousness about it is what you're kind of driving for, because you want the sensory inputs is our auditory sense. It's quite often due to the fact that our ears are placed on the side of our head, are more than likely going to be the first notification that something is amiss. And so causing the players to lose the ability to hear is really fascinating, especially when you invoke it in situations that are on the edge of being combat but haven't yet started. So if your party is sneaking towards a location and they're able to coordinate with each other by verbal commands, fine. But if they all of a sudden one of them steps into an area where their sense of hearing is interfered with, now they have to depend on what they can see, the sign languages or the signals they might have coordinated in advance. If they haven't, it's even more exciting, because then you have to have them try to pantomime to each other what they want to have done in the scene, even as they're playing. They're not allowed to evoke, not to even say what they're supposed to say, because the other person can't hear them. And many of my groups have actually started to develop the skill of chronomy in such a way that they can use it to communicate. Chronomy is the ability to use silent hand gestures for communication. And there's a great example of that recently in the movie Dune, where the Bene Gesserit have a specific sign language. And I'm not sure whether it's actually just the Bene Gesserit or if it's the Atreides family, but they have a certain hand gestures they can make that convey information. And that's really useful tool if you've thought about it. But if the players haven't and they are now in a situation where they can't hear each other, they can make for some exciting and fun role-play experiences of trying to deal with what that will do to the scene if you can't communicate verbally. The next one has more to do with the awareness of the environment, and while some players simply are not acute to that kind of activity, nonetheless the ones who are really suffer badly if they don't have the ability to use their periphery. If they can't be looking down this main hallway and still see something moving over here, it's really dangerous for them. And so playing with this weakened peripheral vision is really a great way to add some surprise and excitement to your group play, because they're now having to determine whether or not they're looking in the direction of the opponent rather than just happening to catch something in their peripheral vision. And taking it away absolutely is arguably tough, because you'd have to explain why their eyes are being altered or whatever. But you can have it simply be a mist or a haze that's reduced their visibility in those areas. Perhaps the lighting is such that it's too bright, and therefore they lose some of their peripheral perspective. Using these tools in a role-play game make it feel more real. If you're a player who plays on a tabletop with miniatures, this is a little harder to represent, other than not placing the models onto the field until they are within the altered line of sight perspectives. So arguably this is more effective in the case of a theater of the mind game, because you're now discussing only what they actually are experiencing, and then you're doing that through narrative, which means they then have to make interpretations of what you said to perceive where those objects are. Makes the game a lot more intriguing. You might want to consider adding additional skills to cover the periphery. There are many that are already in even Dungeons and Dragons that cover these, like alertness or observation. But you can actually enhance this by creating a skill mechanism where they actually have practiced and worked on keeping things in their peripheral vision visible, even working on their eye muscles to do so. Of course, the biggest sensory takeaway would be your visual. If you take away the ability for a player to see something, it really negatively impacts them. So one of the scariest proposals is the use of the condition called blindness, because then they have to depend on other senses to bring them information, and they can't even consider what they see. So now, those who play in a theater of the mind environment are perhaps more attuned with this because they're actually actively putting together what the narrator, game master, was telling them about the environment to build out their understanding of the situation. And so by having your visual input curtailed, it pretty much means you have to be much more acutely aware of what's going on where you are and such. So it's to me, it's really important that the players viscerally feel what's going on in the game, because if you're only describing things in terms of hit point loss or modifiers to die rolls and such, you're really undercutting some of the real power of role play, because the mechanism is more about translating the player into that environment. And when you take away their senses, you force them to think beyond the sphere, so to speak. They've got to think about things in a different way, which enhances the gameplay aspect of it. In the end, sensory deprivation doesn't have to be a thing for most people. You can around such conflict without any need to embrace them, simply because the players don't have any experience with dealing with it. It's crossing the story arguably that's well, because you're going to describe more. But times in Pacific, and we will have a new show for you therefore tonight. And also remember, on Tuesdays in particular, you get updates on the campaigns on Nikos News Day. All right, talk to you later.